Hello again. It is, I think, a matter of common observation that people in Britain who are vehemently opposed to immigration often find themselves in violent disagreement with those who are more relaxed about the phenomenon or even approve of it. Conversation between those who hold different views on this topic are seldom characterized by moderation and a calm, courteous exchange of views. This is a pity. For if both sides were able to talk rationally to each other, they would find that there is a lot of common ground between them. That is to say, many points on which they would agree. I thought that it might be interesting to see if we can come up with some of those areas of consensus and see where it leads us. I am aware that this will result in my being denounced as a fanatical racist, only one step removed from being a grand wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, but let's give it a go anyway. The first point we can, I think, all agree with is that until the end of the Second World War, almost everybody in Britain was white. There were small numbers of black people clustered around ports such as London, Liverpool, and Cardiff, but these were not really communities, but rather changing populations of seamen and so on. There were also Chinese communities, very small ones, and also small number of Indians, often students. Most people in Britain lived their whole lives without even setting eyes upon a black person or an Indian. Now, whether we regard this as a horribly parochial way of life or as an ideal situation doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter either whether anybody says, "Oh well, so what? It doesn't matter. It's not important." I'm simply establishing that that is how things were until the late 1940s. There was at that time an influx of black people from the Caribbean, followed in the 1950s and 1960s by those from India and Pakistan. These were still very small numbers, though, and concentrated in restricted areas of large cities. It was an urban phenomenon, with those in smaller towns or villages still living their lives without even seeing or speaking to anybody other than the white British people. That was the character of the nation. That was how Britain was. Again, this is simply how things were. I pass no comment on whether it was a desirable state of affairs or even if it matters. This was the situation until around the year 2000 when things began to change dramatically. Following Tony Blair becoming Prime Minister in 1997, immigration began to increase very sharply. It continued to rise, and there were particularly large waves, for example, during the premiership of Boris Johnson. This became known as the Boris wave of immigration. During that time, immigrants from Africa and Asia began to be spread out across the whole country, no longer simply in big cities. Small towns and even villages now have their complement of immigrants, and it is no longer the case that British people can live only next to and among other white British people, as used to be the case for thousands of years. Immigration now affects everybody in various ways. Again, leaving aside the question of whether this is a good thing or not, it is impossible to deny that this has been the sequence of events and that it has changed the nature of this country for good or ill. There now you see, even the most bitter enemy of immigration and the greatest supporter of the idea can possibly agree with the broad outline of the history of immigration which I have suggested here. What else can we all agree on? Well, I think we can say that no prospective Prime Minister announced before his or her election that such a thing would be done. That is to say, that they would initiate mass migration to this country. It is not to be found in the manifesto of any party voted into power, and indeed most manifestos say the precise opposite, that if elected, the party will crack down on immigration or asylum seekers and reduce the number of foreigners entering the country. The British people were never offered the opportunity of choosing whether or not this would happen. they were never asked if they wanted to become a minority in their own capital city or if they wished to see the nature of their country changed in this way. The whole enterprise was planned and undertaken without anybody intimating to the population what was going to be done. Here again is something which I think we can all agree upon. Once again, I'm leaving aside the matter of whether this was a desirable course of action. It is a fact that the nature of Britain was deliberately changed by mass migration and that nobody actually asked the British people if they wanted their country to be transformed in this way. Having cleared the ground a little, I think I'll expand on this subject in the future, but at least here are some points upon which we can all agree, and I might be able to build on this consensus in the future.